Nepo babies are not a new thing. In fact, high society has capitalized on this practice throughout all of human civilization. Of course, we all want our children to prosper from our fortunes, but when those fortunes are guaranteed, what incentive do the children have to do anything for themselves? There are glaringly obvious downsides to nepotism, but not all Nepo babies simply coast along on the success and bank balances of their parents. Some of them make a name for themselves and even benefit the world in interesting and exciting ways. One of those people was Charles Hamilton, the creator of Painshill Park. This is Refracted World. Born in 1704, Charles was the son of James Hamilton, 6th Earl of Abercorn, and was given the title of the Honourable at birth. Talk about being born with a silver spoon in your mouth. As the 14th child and the youngest of 9 sons, he was not in line to be the next Earl, but would still benefit from his family's legacy and, of course, their wealth. He was raised in Dublin and later attended Christ Church in Oxford, where in 1723 he received his BA at the tender age of 19. This was during the Age of Enlightenment, when education was a relatively new concept and was not afforded to everyone. But like many modern post-students, Charles travelled throughout Europe on 2 extended grand tours, the first in 1725 and the second in 1732. Around this time, it was fashionable for young male aristocrats to visit places like London, Paris, Amsterdam and Zurich. Some would even venture to Spain and Greece, but the number one country everyone wanted to visit was Italy. Venice, Florence and Rome were at the top of every rich boy's bucket list. Therefore, the idea of the Grand Tour was born. As this was way before budget airlines and last-minute holiday deals, recreational travel was costly and could sometimes take weeks to get to your destination. Therefore, it was a privilege reserved only for the rich, as only they could afford the extravagant cost, both in money and in time. But this was touted as something which would benefit more than just the young aristocrats practicing their Latin. Many of them had an interest in art, and some were able to recreate what they saw, bringing back painted and sculpted snapshots for the enjoyment and study of the peasants back home. As a speaker of both Latin and Greek, Charles Hamilton was well suited to European travel. He was also gifted with a creative imagination. But first, duty. After his initial grand tour in 1727, he became the representative of Strabane in the Irish House of Commons, although he seems to have been less interested in his constitutional duties and spent most of his time in England. He later represented Truro in the British House of Commons and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. In 1732, Charles took his second grand tour of Europe, which would be so formidable it would cement his name and his legacy for centuries to come. He spent most of his time in Italy, collecting antiquities and artwork, and even studied landscape painting. On his return, he wanted to bring Europe back with him. Unfortunately, his father died in 1734, and with his passing, Charles lost access to the family coffers. His sister was mistress of the Prince of Wales at the time, and in 1738, her influence led to Charles being appointed as a clerk of the household. That same year, with the financial help of a loan from his friend Henry Fox, he acquired 200 acres of land in Painshill, Surrey, with the intention of creating a landscape reminiscent of his European travels. Unfortunately, there isn't a publicly available record of the exact amount he paid for the land, but given his wealth and the size of the estate, the purchase price could have been anywhere between £10,000 and £20,000, which would be the equivalent of £2.8 to £5.6 million in today's money. It was hardly prime real estate though. One account at the time described it as so poor as to not produce anything but heath and broom. Sometimes all you need is a creative brain to be able to visualize what could be. And with his knowledge, an interest in plants, and his talent for imaginative design, Charles set out to work on his vision. He lived in an existing house on the outskirts of the land and always planned to build a bigger, extravagant home inside the park. Unfortunately, that never happened. His first task was to make the land usable, so the heathland was burned and the ash used to fertilize the soil. Root vegetables were planted and grown, and livestock were brought in, which once again added more fertilization. Eventually, grass began to grow, and water from the River Mole was pumped into the park by means of a water wheel, which created waterfalls and a grand lake. Charles wanted to produce a beautiful landscape which challenged the formal, symmetrical gardens which were popular in the era, and have the beauty of nature be the focal point. He planted many new tree species from all over the world, including those from North America, the seeds of which were collected on his travels or sent to him by friends overseas. No doubt inspired by French and Italian countryside, Charles also set about planting 2 vineyards. His first attempt at red wine did not go well, but this didn't dissuade him. He would continue planting grapes until he got it right, and a decade later he succeeded, writing, "My wine had a finer flavour than the best champagne I ever tasted." Word quickly spread of Charles's accomplishments, and the first visitor to the newly created pleasure garden was the second Duke of Richmond in 1745. 2 years later, Horace Walpole visited and wrote that Charles has really made a fine place out of a most cursed hill. Painshill had been reshaped into a beautiful park full of landscapes and scenic vistas. Unfortunately, not everything in Charles's life was a bed of roses. He had fallen out of favour with the Prince of Wales, and in 1746 lost his main source of income. Money and the loss of it was a recurring theme in Charles's life, perhaps because he had never needed to learn the value of it when growing up. Painshill was a huge swath of land which needed constant maintenance just to upkeep what was already there. But this was just the first stage of Charles's plans. There was so much more he wanted to achieve. He erected a Gothic tower to capitalise on the views it would afford from its 27-metre height. Styled as if plucked from a fairy tale, one would expect to see Rapunzel's hair tumbling down the side of it. Today, when the skies are clear, you can see all the way to Canary Wharf and Windsor Castle. A number of stylised bridges were constructed to navigate visitors across the 14-acre lake. One of these bridges you would likely recognise. The 5-arch bridge has been made famous in recent years for being used in the Netflix series Bridgerton. Adding to the visitor experience of the 18th century was the Hermitage. A quaint rustic cottage was built into the trees and was home to the hermit. These were hired by landowners to reside in the gardens and live a simple life. Don't be fooled into thinking this was the landowners being generous though. The hermit was in effect a member of staff, as a tourist attraction. Visitors would come and observe the hermit and speculate what they were thinking, why they would choose this way of life, and if they were happier living in nature. As per their contract, Painshill Park's hermit must be silent at all times, must wear a goat's hair robe with no shoes, and never cut his hair, nails or beard. If the hermit fulfilled this contract without stepping foot outside of the park for 7 years, he would be awarded with £500 to £700, which is around £95,000 to £130,000 today. A Mr. Remington was hired for the role, but just 3 weeks later he was seen drinking in the local pub. He didn't get his money. In 1759, Charles built the Turkish tent. Positioned on a hill overlooking the lake, this was the perfect place for visitors to admire their surroundings. He clearly loved travelling and especially enjoyed his time in Italy. One of the artifacts he brought back from his time there was a bust of Bacchus, the god of wine and festivities. This is the same god the Greeks called Dionysus. Yes, the same one that created such a fuss at the Paris Olympics. European history and mythology clearly fascinated Charles, as 30 years later, in 1762, he built the Temple of Bacchus on park grounds, a grand building in the style of Roman architecture, which housed his collection of Roman statues and busts. In 1765, the creative visionary wanted to build something so wonderful and so eye-catching it would be a talking point for all his visitors. Inspired by his visits to grottos in the Italian Renaissance gardens, he employed Joseph Lane, a celebrated grotto maker who was commissioned to build a crystal cave inside the park. It took many years to construct, with the use of various natural materials, including rock crystals, shells, and minerals. At a cost of £8,000, which would be $500,000 in today's money, the finished effect is breathtakingly beautiful. Walking through the Crystal Grotto is an enchanting experience, with shimmering rocks and a sparkling ambience. The portholes look like they've been created by the water that's lapping at the side of them, and with dapples of sunlight streaming through, it produces this serene sense of calm. The last attraction built in the park was the ruined abbey. Added to the side of the lake, this really does look like an ancient building that has been ravaged by the sands of time. Sometimes additions like this can stand out for the wrong reasons, but the ruined abbey blends into the landscape as if it had always been there. Painshill Park was hailed as a masterpiece, but one which Charles could no longer hold on to. The enormous cost of building, maintaining and renovating had left him with massive amounts of debt and no income to honour them. Therefore, in 1773, he was forced to hand over Painshill to his debtors. This must have been an extremely difficult thing for him to do. This was his life's work. There was nothing else like it in the world, and at the end of it all, he was forced to walk away with nothing. Charles Hamilton moved to Bath, where he continued gardening throughout his retirement, until his death in 1786, aged 82. Yet Charles's legacy still lives on. Painshill Park is now owned by the Elmbridge Borough Council and managed by the Painshill Trust. It is a Grade 1 listed park, and they maintain the 200 acres of land and all of its many attractions. Charles's vision lives on and will likely be seen and appreciated by millions of visitors for many more years. If Charles had not come from nobility and been cradled by his family's wealth, he would not have toured Europe and would not have built the park. But this isn't a shining example of when nepotism works, quite the opposite. There will have been many more creative people living at the same time as Charles who would have been able to create something just as beautiful and as grand as Painshill if they had been given the chance. The most talented people in the world are not only the ones who come from privileged backgrounds. Yet how would anyone else be able to showcase what they can do without power, wealth or influence? And this is not something trapped in the past. We see this all the time today in our politicians, pop stars, movie stars and tech entrepreneurs. We all want our children to succeed, but that shouldn't mean only the 1% of children can do so. I actually visited Painshill Park for the first time this summer, and it really is a unique and magical place. It's the reason why I researched the history to make this video. If you're ever in the area, you should definitely spend a day walking around this fascinating park. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, comment if you have the time, or even share it with your friends. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel. It will help me grow and continue creating content. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.